They called them suicide bottles. The veteran Luftwaffe pilots, men with Knight's Crosses and victory tallies in the dozens, would watch American Mustangs lumbering into the air from English bases, each wing burdened with two enormous teardrop-shaped metal tanks. They looked absurd, these appendages hanging beneath the sleek fighters' wings. Clumsy, vulnerable, a death sentence in a dogfight. In the officers' mess at Luftwaffe bases across occupied Europe, the aces would laugh over their evening schnapps. "Let them come with their fuel tanks," they said. "The moment we engage, they'll have to drop them. They'll tumble through the air for 10 seconds, defenseless, while we line up our shots. It's like they're gift-wrapping their own destruction." But standing on the flight line at Debden, England, on a cold morning in December 1943, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group wasn't laughing. He was doing math. Each of those drop tanks held 108 gallons of fuel. His Mustang's internal tanks held 184 gallons. Together, that meant nearly 400 gallons of range. 400 gallons meant he could fly to Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat. 400 gallons meant the Luftwaffe had nowhere left to hide. This is the story of how a simple aluminum tank, dismissed as a liability by the world's most experienced fighter pilots, became the weapon that destroyed the Luftwaffe. Not through firepower or speed, but through something far more devastating: the ability to be everywhere, all the time, until the enemy had nothing left to fight with. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal equilibrium. The United States 8th Air Force was sending hundreds of bombers deep into Germany daily, targeting the industrial heart of the Third Reich: ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, aircraft plants in Regensburg, synthetic oil refineries across the Ruhr Valley. The Marder, bombers were flying, the bombs were falling, but the cost was unsustainable. On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked Schweinfurt. 60 bombers never came home. Over 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. The survivors called it Black Thursday. Bomber crews calculated their survival odds with grim precision. You needed to fly 25 missions to complete your tour, but with loss rates hovering between 5 and 10% per mission, the statistics were murderous. Most crews wouldn't make it. The problem was simple and seemingly unsolvable. American fighters didn't have the range to escort bombers all the way to their targets. The rugged P-47 Thunderbolt could fly about 450 miles from base before turning back. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could stretch to about 550 miles, but Berlin was over 550 miles from England. Munich was nearly 600. The deepest targets in Germany, places like Posen or Breslau, were simply unreachable. This created what bomber crews called the gap. For the first hour or two of a mission, American fighters would protect them. Then, somewhere over Belgium or Western Germany, the little friends would waggle their wings in farewell and turn for home. From that point until fighters could meet them on the return journey, the bombers were alone, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighter tactics had evolved into a brutal science. Experienced grouper commanders like Egon Meyer had developed the head-on attack, coming straight at bomber formations at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour, firing 20mm and 30mm cannon at the bombers' vulnerable nose sections. Other units specialized in the attack from above, diving through formations and raking them with machine gun fire. The Luftwaffe had the luxury of choosing when and where to fight. They could mass their strength against unescorted bomber formations while conserving their forces when American fighters were present. They could land, refuel, rearm, and attack again on the same mission. Their pilots flew over their own territory. If shot down, they could parachute to safety and be flying again the next day. They were winning through geography. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The answer to this crisis arrived not as a revolutionary new fighter design, but as something far more prosaic: better fuel tanks. The drop tank, or external fuel tank, wasn't new technology. The concept dated back to the First World War. Essentially, it was an auxiliary fuel tank mounted externally on an aircraft, usually under the wings or fuselage. Once empty, or when combat was imminent, the pilot could release it, shedding the weight and drag. But making a drop tank that actually worked in combat conditions was far more difficult than it sounded. The tank had to be strong enough to hold fuel under flight loads. It needed proper seals to prevent leaks at high altitude, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The fuel system had to be designed so the pilot could select whether to draw fuel from the drop tanks or internal tanks. The release mechanism had to work reliably, every time, because a tank that wouldn't drop could get you killed, and critically, the tanks couldn't create too much drag. Every pound of drag meant slower speeds, worse handling, and higher fuel consumption, which defeated the entire purpose. Early drop tank designs were often failures. They leaked. They created so much drag that they negated their own benefit. They froze at altitude. They wouldn't release. They fell off accidentally. Fighter pilots hated them. The breakthrough came through a combination of British ingenuity and American industrial might. In 1942 and 43, engineers worked on two parallel approaches. The first was pressed metal tanks, made from stamped steel formed into two halves and welded together. These were strong and reliable, but heavy and expensive. Each tank required skilled metalworkers and scarce materials. The second approach was more radical. Paper tanks. Yes, paper. Or more precisely, layers of resin-impregnated craft paper formed over a mould under heat and pressure, then coated with plastic film. The British called them commotion tanks, after the process used to make them. They were cheap, lightweight, and could be manufactured by the thousands using materials and workers not needed for critical war production. Initially, paper tanks leaked like sieves and disintegrated in rough weather. But through relentless testing and refinement, engineers created versions that could hold fuel reliably. A paper drop tank for a Mustang weighed about 60 pounds empty, compared to nearly 100 pounds for a pressed metal tank. That 40-pound difference mattered enormously when you were trying to wring maximum range from every gallon of fuel. By mid-1943, production was ramping up. Factories across Britain and America were turning out thousands of drop tanks monthly. They came in different sizes: 75-gallon tanks, 108-gallon tanks, even 150-gallon tanks for the longest missions. And the 8th Air Force was accumulating them by the tens of thousands, stacked in massive pyramids near every fighter base in England. But having the tanks wasn't enough. Pilots needed to learn how to use them effectively, and this required changing decades of fighter pilot doctrine and culture. Fighter pilots were trained to be aggressive, offensive, to seek out enemy fighters and destroy them. The idea of flying with ungainly fuel tanks attached, of being burdened with extra weight and drag, went against every instinct. More than that, German propaganda had been quite effective. Luftwaffe radio broadcasts mocked American fighters with their gasoline bottles, claiming they were proof of American cowardice and desperation. "They'll come begging for mercy once we shoot those tanks off their wings," one broadcast sneered. "Your so-called Mustangs are nothing but fuel tankers with machine guns." Even some American commanders doubted the concept. During training exercises in England, pilots complained the tanks made their fighters sluggish and vulnerable. In a turning dogfight, the additional weight and drag could be the difference between getting on someone's tail or having them get on yours. And if you had to drop the tanks to fight, you'd just reduced your range back to nothing. What changed everything was a shift in thinking about what fighter escorts were supposed to do. The old doctrine, escort fighters should stay close to the bombers, proved ineffective. German fighters would simply avoid the escorts, waiting for gaps in coverage or attacking from angles the escorts couldn't effectively defend. The new doctrine, championed by aggressive commanders like Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group and Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, was simple. Hunt them down. Don't wait for the Germans to attack. Find them, kill them, force them to fight you instead of the bombers. And with drop tanks, American fighters could now hunt across all of occupied Europe. The mathematics were compelling. A P-51B Mustang with two 108-gallon drop tanks had a combat radius of over 750 miles. That meant it could escort bombers to any target in Germany, engage in combat for 15 to 20 minutes, and still have enough fuel to make it home. The Luftwaffe's geographic advantage had evaporated. On March 4, 1944, 68 P-51B Mustangs carrying drop tanks escorted bombers to Berlin for the first time. The mission was a watershed moment, proving the concept beyond all doubt. But it was just the beginning. Over the coming months, the strategic implications of long-range escort would transform the air war entirely. The Luftwaffe's comfortable defensive strategy collapsed. They could no longer pick and choose their battles. They could no longer concentrate their forces against unescorted bombers. Every mission, anywhere in the Reich, now had American fighters overhead, and those fighters were getting more aggressive. By spring of 1944, the mission brief for P-51 pilots had evolved. Yes, escort the bombers. But once the heavies were safely away from the target, the fighters were to descend and seek targets of opportunity. That meant Luftwaffe airfields. That meant trains. That meant anything that moved. This was the birth of what would become known as the fighter sweep. Small groups of Mustangs, having escorted bombers to Leipzig or Munich or Berlin, would drop down to low altitude on the return flight. They would hunt for German airfields, coming in fast and low, strafing anything they found. Aircraft on the ground, fuel trucks, hangars, personnel. The tactical genius of this approach was brutal in its simplicity. German fighters were most vulnerable at two moments, when taking off and when landing. Both required the aircraft to be slow, low, and in a predictable flight path. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, climbing away from its airfield at 200 miles per hour, gear still retracting, was defenseless against a Mustang diving out of the sun at 400 miles per hour. And it got worse for the Luftwaffe. Because American fighters now had the range to loiter, to wait. Mustang pilots would spot a German airfield, circle at a distance, and watch. Eventually, a groupie of Bf 109 seconds or 4 190 seconds would return from a mission, low on fuel, possibly damaged, certainly exhausted. They'd enter the landing pattern, gear down, flaps down, speed bleeding off, and then the Mustangs would pounce. German pilots called it the Amerikaner Jagd, the American hunt. It was terrifying and inescapable. You could survive combat over the target. You could outfly the escort fighters. But you still had to land, and increasingly, American fighters would be waiting when you did. Major Georg Peter Eder, a Luftwaffe ace with 78 victories, described the experience in his post-war memoir. By 1944, we feared the landing more than the combat. You would see your airfield ahead, safety just minutes away. Then the call would come over the radio. Achtung! Mustangs attacking the field. And you would have to decide. Try to land anyway and risk being shot to pieces in the landing pattern? Divert to another field and hope your fuel would last? Or bail out over friendly territory? None of the options were good. And the Americans could do this because of those despised drop tanks. The tanks that German pilots had mocked as suicide bottles were enabling a systematic campaign of destruction that the Luftwaffe had no answer for. The statistics tell the story with cold precision. In January of 1944, before long-range escort became routine, the 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers. That was a 4.2% loss rate per mission. By June of 1944, after 5 months of systematic fighter escort enabled by drop tanks, bomber losses had fallen to 132 aircraft, despite flying nearly twice as many missions. The loss rate had dropped to 1.9%. In the first quarter of 1944, January through March, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,000 fighter pilots killed or missing. Many were experienced veterans, irreplaceable men who had been fighting since Poland or France or the Battle of Britain. In the second quarter, April through June, that number climbed to over 1,300. The kill ratios shifted dramatically. In early 1943, Luftwaffe fighters were achieving roughly equal exchange rates with American bombers and fighters. One German fighter lost for every one American aircraft destroyed. By mid-1944, that ratio had inverted to catastrophic levels. American fighters were claiming 3, 4, sometimes 5 German aircraft for every loss, and increasingly, those victories weren't happening in fair fights at altitude. They were happening on the ground. Records from the 8th Air Force show that between April and December of 1944, American fighters claimed approximately 4,700 German aircraft destroyed on the ground through strafing attacks. Think about that number. 4,700 aircraft that never had a chance to fight back, destroyed while parked, while taxiing, while desperately trying to take off or land. Each destroyed aircraft represented not just a machine, but hundreds of hours of skilled labor, scarce aluminum, rare metals, irreplaceable manufacturing capacity. A Bf-109 required approximately 10,000 man-hours to build. An FW-190 needed even more. Multiply that by thousands of aircraft, and you begin to understand the industrial hemorrhaging the Luftwaffe was experiencing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The drop tanks that made this all possible were being manufactured at a staggering rate. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies had stockpiled over 100,000 drop tanks in England. Production was exceeding 50,000 per month. They were treated as essentially disposable. Once dropped, they were rarely recovered. Each mission saw hundreds of them released over occupied Europe, tumbling into fields and forests, a rain of aluminum and paper that marked the path of American air power. German civilians and soldiers collected them when they could. The metal tanks could be repurposed. The paper tanks were sometimes used for storage or cut up for their resin coating, but mostly they were just left where they fell, silent testimony to the industrial might arrayed against Germany. There's a particular irony in how the Luftwaffe's own tactical success in the early war sowed the seeds of their later defeat. In 1940 and 1941, German fighters had enjoyed what they called freie Jagd, free hunting. They could range across the battlefield, seeking targets of opportunity, engaging when they held the advantage and breaking off when they didn't. German aces had built their enormous victory tallies through this aggressive, offensive fighter doctrine, but freie Jagd only worked when you had the range to hunt freely. German fighters in the Battle of Britain had been constrained by limited fuel. Bf 109 seconds escorting bombers to London were operating at their maximum range. They could only fight for a few minutes before having to turn for France. The Luftwaffe's solution had been drop tanks. Bf-109Es were fitted with a 300-litre drop tank that extended their combat radius by about 60 miles. But German drop tank technology never evolved beyond that initial capability. The Luftwaffe faced different strategic circumstances. They were fighting a defensive war over their own territory. Their fighters didn't need to fly 600 miles to reach the enemy. The enemy was coming to them, so they focused on other priorities. Heavier armament, better armour, improved engines. Range became secondary. This was a fatal strategic miscalculation. The Germans assumed the air war would remain a defensive struggle, with American bombers coming to them. They never anticipated that American fighters would not just escort the bombers, but would actively hunt German fighters across the entire Reich. They never imagined that their own airfields, their training bases, their aircraft factories would become frontline combat zones. The introduction of reliable, mass-produced drop tanks gave American fighters a strategic reach that fundamentally changed the nature of the air war. It wasn't enough to shoot down the bombers anymore. The Luftwaffe had to defend everywhere, all the time. They had to protect their airfields, their fuel depots, their rail lines, their training schools, and they simply didn't have the numbers or the fuel to do it. By late summer of 1944, the situation had become desperate. Luftwaffe pilot training had been slashed from over 200 hours to less than 150 hours. New pilots were being sent to combat units with minimal instrument time, inadequate gunnery training, and sometimes less than 50 hours in the aircraft they'd be flying in combat. They were lambs to the slaughter. One such pilot was Feldwebel Heinz Nock, who recorded his experiences in a diary later published as I Flew for the Führer. In August of 1944, Nock wrote about encountering a formation of P-51 seconds near Hanover. They were everywhere, above us, beside us, behind us. Our tactical manual said to engage in a turning fight where the 109 held the advantage. But these Mustangs simply refused to turn with us. They would make one high-speed pass, fire, and then accelerate away before we could respond. If we chased them, more Mustangs would dive on us from above. If we ignored them, they would return and attack again. We lost 4 aircraft in 10 minutes without shooting down a single American. Knock survived that engagement, but his observation was damning. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, developed against shorter-range Allied fighters, no longer worked. The Mustangs had the fuel to maintain altitude, to wait for the perfect moment, to break off and reset if the situation looked unfavorable. German pilots were forced into desperate, energy-bleeding maneuvers just to survive, while American pilots could dictate the terms of every engagement. The German High Command understood the threat. In May of 1944, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, issued a directive that no one was to call the American fighters Mustangs anymore. They were to be referred to only as Indians. The official reason was to prevent defeatism. The real reason was that the word Mustang had become synonymous with doom in the minds of German pilots. But changing what you called the enemy didn't change reality. The Mustangs, laden with their drop tanks, continued to range across Germany, and the destruction mounted. The numbers from specific operations illustrate the scale of the catastrophe. On April 8, 1944, during a massive raid on German airfields and aircraft factories, 8th Air Force fighters claimed 237 German aircraft destroyed in the air and another 177 destroyed on the ground. In a single day, that's more aircraft than some nations' entire air forces. May 19, 1944. American fighters escorting bombers to Berlin claimed 111 German aircraft destroyed. June 21, 1944. During a mission to Berlin and Ruhland, 102 German aircraft destroyed. These weren't occasional successes. This was systematic, industrial-scale destruction happening almost daily. The Germans tried to adapt. They dispersed their aircraft to smaller, less obvious airfields. They built camouflaged revetments and underground hangars. They scheduled operations at night or in bad weather, when American fighters were less likely to be active. They increased anti-aircraft defenses around their bases. Nothing worked. Drop tanks meant American fighters could reach even the most remote airfields. The Mustangs' long endurance meant they could afford to wait through bad weather for gaps in the clouds, and the sheer number of American fighters meant that even heavily defended airfields faced overwhelming attacks. One particularly devastating example occurred in late July of 1944. The 8th Air Force launched Operation Starkey, a coordinated strike against Luftwaffe facilities across central Germany. Over 700 P-51 Mustangs, each carrying drop tanks, swept across a 200-mile front. They hit 32 different airfields in a 4-hour period. German defenders shot down 9 American fighters. The Americans destroyed over 300 German aircraft on the ground and claimed 97 more in the air. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The Luftwaffe could not sustain losses at this rate. German aircraft production was actually increasing through 1944, peaking at over 3,000 fighters per month. But production didn't matter if the aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could be properly deployed. Even more critical was the pilot shortage. You could build a Bf-109 in weeks. Training a competent fighter pilot took months, even years. And the Luftwaffe's pilot training program was collapsing under multiple pressures. Allied bombing had destroyed training aircraft and facilities. Fuel shortages meant student pilots got minimal flight time, and experienced instructors were being pulled from training duties and sent to combat units to replace catastrophic losses. By autumn of 1944, the average Luftwaffe fighter pilot had less than half the flight experience of his American counterpart. Many German pilots were being shot down on their first or second combat missions, sometimes by American pilots who themselves had only been in combat for a few months. The experience gap had become a chasm, and still the Mustangs came, their drop tanks allowing them to penetrate deeper and stay longer. The Luftwaffe's final major attempt to contest air superiority came during Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945. Over 900 Luftwaffe fighters launched a surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands, hoping to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground in a massive coordinated strike. The operation achieved initial surprise and inflicted significant damage, destroying or damaging nearly 300 Allied aircraft. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 300 fighters in the operation, many to Allied anti-aircraft fire, others shot down by the few Allied fighters that managed to take off. More devastating than the aircraft losses were the pilot casualties. Over 200 Luftwaffe pilots were killed, wounded, or captured, including many experienced formation leaders and flight instructors. The Luftwaffe never recovered from Bodenplatte. Within weeks, American fighters with their ever-present drop tanks were roaming German skies virtually unopposed. The sight that had once seemed absurd, those teardrop-shaped tanks hanging from fighter wings, had become the symbol of Germany's total defeat in the air. The final accounting is staggering. Between January 1944 and May 1945, American fighters of the 8th and 9th Air Forces claimed approximately 10,000 German aircraft destroyed in air combat. They claimed another 5,000 destroyed on the ground through strafing. Those 15,000 aircraft represented the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. Each destroyed aircraft took with it the aluminum, the steel, the rare metals, the rubber, the optical glass, the hundreds of specialized components that German industry could barely produce under the rain of Allied bombs. Each lost pilot took with him months or years of training, combat experience, tactical knowledge that couldn't be replaced. And it had all been enabled by a simple aluminum or paper tank filled with gasoline. The drop tank didn't win the air war by itself. The Mustang's excellent design, the skill of American pilots, the overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft, the systematic targeting of German oil production, all these factors contributed. But without drop tanks, none of it would have been possible. The bitter irony wasn't lost on German veterans after the war. General Lieutenant Adolf Garland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, reflected in his memoir, "The situation became hopeless when the American fighters began appearing over Berlin. But it wasn't just that they reached Berlin. It was that they came back, day after day, and they were waiting for us when we landed, when we were most vulnerable. We had no sanctuary left. Every airfield became a battlefield, and those external tanks they carried, which we had mocked as a weakness, turned out to be the weapon that destroyed us." Johannes Steinhoff, another high-ranking Luftwaffe ace, was even more direct. "We thought they were idiots, flying with those huge fuel tanks, making them slow and clumsy. We joked about how easy they would be to shoot down. Then they dropped the tanks and ran us down like dogs, and when we tried to land, they were waiting. The joke was on us." The veterans who flew those missions remember the drop tanks differently. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in P-51 seconds and was credited with 16¼ victories, put it simply in a post-war interview. Those drop tanks were ugly, and they made the airplane handle like a truck. But they let us go anywhere, do anything. They let us take the fight to the Germans instead of waiting for them to come to us. I dropped hundreds of those tanks over Europe. Every single one was worth its weight in gold. The technology outlived the war. Drop tanks became standard equipment for jet fighters in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Modern fighter aircraft still use them for the same reason they worked in 1944. They extend range without permanently compromising performance. The principle remains unchanged. Carry extra fuel externally, drop it when you need to fight. But the scale of what happened over Germany between 1944 and 1945 has never been repeated. 15,000 aircraft destroyed. An entire nation's air force systematically ground into scrap metal and lost pilots. An air superiority so complete that by war's end, Allied aircraft flew supply missions over German territory without bothering to carry ammunition. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the Luftwaffe had perhaps 200 serviceable fighters remaining from a force that had once numbered in the thousands. Most had no fuel. Many had no pilots. They sat on airfields across Germany, silent and still, while overhead American fighters flew victory rolls. Those American fighters still carried drop tanks, not because they needed them anymore, there was no enemy left to fight, but because it had become habit, doctrine, the way things were done. The tanks hung beneath the wings, like badges of honor, like the tools that had won the war. The young Luftwaffe aces who had laughed at those tanks in 1943, if they survived, had long since stopped laughing. They had learned the hardest way possible that in war, the side with greater range, greater endurance, greater strategic reach will eventually win. No amount of courage or skill can overcome an enemy who can strike anywhere, anytime, and retreat before you can respond. The drop tank represented something fundamental about how America fought the war. It wasn't elegant or heroic. It was practical, industrial, overwhelming. It took an existing capability and extended it until the enemy had no response. It turned tactical superiority into strategic dominance. Every one of those 15,000 destroyed German fighters represented a battle that never had to be fought, a bomber crew that came home safely, a pilot who survived his 25 missions, a step closer to victory. The cost was measured in thousands of drop tanks tumbling from fighter wings, scattered across the fields and forests of Europe. They're still there, some of them, in French pastures, German woods, Belgian farmland. Farmers occasionally turn them up while ploughing. Metal detectorists find them. They're corroded now, barely recognizable, but they're there. Silent witnesses to the day American fighters learned to outrange, outlast, and ultimately destroy the most feared air force in the world. The German pilots had been right about one thing. The drop tanks were vulnerable. In a dogfight, they were a liability. But that assumed the Germans could force a dogfight on their terms. And with drop tanks, American fighters never had to fight on German terms. They could choose when to fight, where to fight, and when to disengage. They could hunt at will across the entire Reich. The Luftwaffe aces had laughed at the idea that those clumsy external tanks could matter. They learned otherwise. They learned it in the flaming wreckage of airfields from Hamburg to Munich. They learned it as they watched their numbers dwindle, as they attended funerals for friends, as their squadrons were consolidated again and again due to losses that couldn't be replaced. By the end, they understood. The suicide bottles weren't on the American fighters. They were in the Luftwaffe's strategic assumptions. The Germans had built a defensive air force to defend the Reich. The Americans had built an offensive air force to destroy the Reich's defenders. And they'd done it with something as simple as an extra fuel tank. 15,000 German fighters burned over the Reich because their pilots never imagined that range could be a more devastating weapon than firepower. They never believed that the ability to be everywhere, all the time, could break an air force more completely than any number of cannon or machine guns. The drop tanks that the Luftwaffe aces mocked didn't just extend range. They extended American will across every mile of German airspace. They transformed a fighter force into an occupation army of the sky. They made the impossible routine, and the routine unstoppable. That's how wars are won, not always through brilliant tactics or superior courage, but sometimes through simple tools used with relentless determination, through industrial might applied with strategic vision, through the ability to be there, everywhere, until the enemy has nowhere left to run. The last Luftwaffe fighters flew their final sorties in early May of 1945, still dodging American Mustangs that carried those despised drop tanks. The war ended days later. The survivors went home to a destroyed nation, to occupation and reconstruction. Some eventually joined the new German Air Force in the 1950s, flying alongside their former enemies in NATO. And when those old pilots, German and American, met at reunions in the decades after the war, they would sometimes talk about the technology that had mattered most, not the jets or the rockets or the wonder weapons, but simple things. Radar, drop tanks, the unglamorous tools that had actually decided the outcome. The Germans would shake their heads at the memory. We thought we could outlast you. We thought our homeland advantage, our experienced pilots, our defensive strategy would be enough. Then you showed up with those tanks, and suddenly we were fighting on every airfield, at every altitude, all day, every day. You didn't have to beat us in every fight. You just had to be at every fight. And we couldn't sustain that. The Americans would nod. That was the idea. Not to make the perfect fighter, but to make the fighter that could reach you wherever you were. Those tanks gave us the world's longest fist, and we punched until there was nothing left to hit. 15,000 German fighters destroyed. More than just machines, more than just metal and rivets and armoured glass. Each one represented the end of someone's war, someone's life, someone's hope that Germany could still somehow win. The drop tanks that made it possible weren't perfect. They leaked sometimes, they created drag, they were awkward and clumsy. But they worked. And in war, Working is all that matters. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.